Okay, I think we are underway here. Welcome everybody to another Parlor Car chat. Today's topic is about the restoration of a Davenport locomotive and the history of such, which I will let our presenter totally talk about. And speaking of our presenter, that's Karl Hovanitz. Most of you, I'm pretty sure, unless we have some international guests involved here, will recognize Karl from Bitter Creek and from San Luis Obispo Railroad Museum, where we are. And here in a second, I'm just going to turn it over to Karl, and we'll take off. But before I do that, I have this slide up here to remind everybody that this is, in fact, a program of the SLO Railroad Museum, and make a minimal plea that there is a donation opportunity available on the website to help the museum continue to get through this year at its virtually zero income level, because it's shut down for COVID stuff. So if that moves you, that would be great. We'd love to see you do that. But that's not what we're here for today. We're here for today the topic of Davenport steam locomotive. And Karl, I'm going to go to the first slide, and you can just take it away and let me know when you want the next ones.
Sounds good. Good morning, everybody. I'm Karl Hovanitz, and I'm responsible for Norgrove Gardens here. I'm the manager in charge of operations. And we have completed a restoration of a locomotive that was built for the U.S. Army in France for World War I. Our government has helped out the French forces for years in France, and then we got much more involved in 1917 and 1918 before the armistice in November 11th, 1918. And one of the things we did was build a huge stockpile of equipment and arms and things to support the effort for the French for the battle against the trenches. And that included a 2-foot gauge portable railway system for transportation from men, equipment, materials, food, armaments to the trenches. Basically what we did was help supply equipment that could use the existing equipment. And the history of these goes back to the 1870s, when the French made field railways to haul agricultural supplies. Before they had motorized vehicles with rubber tires, you couldn't run rubber tires or certain equipment into a wet field. So they had semi-permanent railroad tracks with snap track, kind of like your LGB track. And a lot of the equipment they used looked like LGB, basically. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. Interesting note is most of the stuff was metric. The tracks they were using was 600 millimeters, which is 3/8 of an inch under 2 feet. So that's what our railroad at Norgrove Gardens is being built to. And equipment you'll see on this slide here, this is from the actual Davenport locomotive catalog from 1918 or 1919, showing the specifications of the locomotive. They were loaded probably 40,000 pounds, very nicely built locomotives, extremely high quality, and they were painted actually like the tanks of the time. They were military vehicles. These were tools of the trade. They actually supplied the trenches with all the materials they needed. These particular, I'm kind of shortcutting a lot of the history here, but these particular locomotives made by Davenport, they built 80 of these for use in France, but none of them ever got shipped. The armistice was signed November 11th, 1918, and this locomotive that we have, the 5240, was under construction at that time and wasn't finished until May 1919. And at that time, it was put into storage in Columbus, Ohio, in a military warehouse for the Army engineers, and remained there for many, many years until it was deemed surplus sometime in the 1920s. And at that time, in the 1920s, our locomotive was sent back to the manufacturer for reasons we don't know, along with its sister locomotive, the 5245, which we also have, was stored until the 1930s at the manufacturer's backyard, basically. Both those locomotives, we assume that parts had been removed. My guess is they've been removed for spare parts for other locomotives. Most of the other Davenports went to military installations to use in Fort Dix, New Jersey, had about 8 of them. There was another half a dozen in Fort Benning, Georgia. Pearl Harbor had some. They were all over the country, used in military installations as interplant switch engines and equipment. We built thousands, probably about 4,500 cars to go over there. Another couple other numbers here. 195 locomotives were built by Baldwin to the same specifications. Another 40 were made by Vulcan. And they built locomotives for another 6 or 8 months until the Army canceled the contract when they knew the armistice was going to hold. When they first signed the armistice, they thought it was going to be temporary, and in fact it became permanent. And of course then later on, Armistice Day became Veterans Day to honor all the different veterans from all the wars instead of just that particular Great War. But to go back through the locomotive, and if you want to change slides there, Jamie, there were other manufacturers. Baldwin here on the left top of your page here had made some different different manufacturers, same basic design. The Vulcan had, because it came after the 195 locomotives that Baldwin made that were shipped to France and served, they kept making improvements. There were some shortcomings they find because of the short lead time required in the design. They found that they had a couple of problems that crept in. They tended to be top heavy, and when they derailed, they tended to roll over because of the high center of gravity in the narrow gauge. These were pretty big engines. The one on the top right was built by Alco Locomotive Works, and a little different design. They were made for the British forces in France, the other northern part of the trenches. The British ran the same 600 millimeter or 23 5/8 inch gauge system. And the French ran about 200 miles of track. The British ran about 200 miles of track. And it was highly portable. I think that was the total amount ever made. Any particular day it changed because these literally were under fire. These trains ran in night. They did have locomotives, but they were rarely used because at night became a target. If you notice, locomotives didn't have bells on them because they were shining, and if you rang them, you attract attention to yourself. They ran with permanent tracks and temporary tracks that were highly flexible. The Alco, you probably can't see in the picture, was an outside frame engine, which probably was a better design because they were a little more stable, like the K36s like you see on the Durango and Silverton and the Cumbres and Toltec. Outside frame engines were a little bit better designed for stability. And there was a couple of them. There's a couple of existing engines in France. There's an Alco existing in the Festiniog Railroad in Wales. If anybody had ever been there, that's called the Mountaineer. An earlier design on the top and the bottom right there, a 4/6 wheel arrangement. They had found that was totally unsuitable. It was very unstable and wouldn't. It tended to derail a lot, which became a real problem later on in the war. Anyway, a couple of different examples there. If you want to go to the next slide, Jamie. Our particular engine had kind of an interesting history. It was built, never used by the War Department, went back to the manufacturer, and then sold in the 1930s to a man named Hyatt Byron. And he had built a backyard railroad called the Byron Railroad for locals in Iowa. It ran around his house. There was a little creek, an 80-foot long bridge he had there. That is this locomotive that we have, and you'll see pictures of later on in his backyard. That's his house on the left. And he ran from after his service in the Army after World War II up into the 1960s intermittently with this locomotive. When he got the locomotive, I don't believe it was complete. I think a large portions were missing, largely to the fact that he rebuilt it with a boiler from a traction engine. Like you've seen those case traction engines with like tractors. I think that was the boiler. We do know there's a port here on because when it was sitting on the frame when we found it, most of the parts were missing. But there were a couple of key parts we wanted. In this picture, he had installed a bell, a full-size locomotive headlight, but he had trimmed it out. He had taken a real 2-foot gauge engine and made a model 2-foot gauge engine out of it to run on his home railroad. Interesting philosophy. It was missing the trailing truck, so it ran as a 260 instead of a 262. He had cut off about 6 inches of the frame with a torch. The tender was sheet metal with a tank. I have the tank at the Bitter Creek right now, and I saved a lot of parts that were unique. I have the cab from this locomotive at the Bitter Creek that'll become a little shed. I don't like to throw things out. It ran on speeder wheels. Most of that in the restoration we brought with us usable parts. The rest of it we became part of an auction later on. Interesting reuse of the historic engine much later, 20 to 30 years after it was built. Jamie, you want to go to the next slide, please? This is another shot in his backyard in Iowa. This is probably early 1960s, judging by the Kodachrome or Anscochrome. He had made some cars. It was literally a home railroad. His brother worked in the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy roundhouse. So a lot of the details they added came from retired or scrapped locomotives that were hanging around the Preston, Iowa roundhouse. He got large full-size locomotive headlights. It had a full-size locomotive whistle. It had a full-size locomotive bell that was still kind of, for over the years, kind of traveled with it. We got it. There wasn't much of this remaining on the locomotive, but parts had traveled. But anyway, this was his recreation, or his model he made out of a historical railroad chassis. It ran into the 1960s, probably intermittently. As people had said, it tended to derail a lot, and I don't have any real documentation of that. But anyway, next slide, Jamie. Anyway, after a period of many years, and after I had removed everything that wasn't historical, this is what remained. I spent 3 days cleaning the chassis with our steam cleaner, getting off hay. It was in a barn. It was covered with dirt, hay, tractor parts, oil, all mixed together. And some of the changes he had made, he had mounted this traction engine boiler to the chassis. And if you look up into the saddle of the chassis where the boiler would mount on the front above the cylinders, you'll see there's the blast nozzle. That's where the cylinders had collected the steam from the cylinders, and they used the blast to create the draft in the boiler. Well, the saddle was adjusted and the boiler raised to fit this non-historical boiler, and he actually used rebar and concrete to make the saddle correct for that. So it was kind of crude, and we had to go to great effort just to bring it back to a historic chassis. The best part about it, he didn't use it much, and most everything was as built. All the brass in the bearings was all in the original location. All the original boiler numbers were there. So basically, when we dismantled it for reconstruction and painting, we were actually mostly able just to re-polish and refit the surfaces and left them in their original positions. It was really quite clever how the shop was able to do that. Jamie, next slide. Reversing it was interesting. We had to find a lot of parts from other sources. We were able to locate this locomotive's other sister, which existed in New York State in similar conditions. It was actually sitting on a truck trailer outside. We were able to get parts of it. There was a little more of the original fabric there, but none of the side tacks existed. Cab had been changed, and it had the same 100 years of neglect, being in and out of barns with several different owners. But we were able to reconstruct the engine with the skilled staff here and made new tanks, all new sheet metal. We had to recontour the domes to meet the original profiles. And there was a lot of real skill being able to reconstruct the locomotive using other locomotives drawings. We didn't have the drawings as built from Davenport, but we did have most of the drawings available from Baldwin. But we knew they were different, but not exactly different. They were similar. So we were able to adjust a few things and reassemble it. This is the assembly stage. We're building parts and putting it together. The chassis had already been rebuilt by this stage. We had already rebuilt a trailing truck and put it underneath. We had new wheels made for the trailing truck. We had enough parts made for both locomotives because eventually the next one will be going through the shops and getting it. And you can see as things fit together, you have to then fit parts and then find a way to make sure that the parts that bolt to them will all then be made correctly to fit. Jamie, the next slide. One of the locomotives, interestingly, was, this is probably not in the best order, but after the 1930s, several of the locomotives had ended up in secondary use. And this is actually 3 of the locomotives that ended up in a construction yard in San Francisco. Probably remained there for a few years. Somebody had said later on that they had gone to San Leandro or in somebody's yard over there, and then they disappeared, probably a scrap during World War II. So of the 80 engines that Davenport had built, they got distributed to construction yards, other uses. We know several of them had come to California, but most of them didn't get documented. Next slide, please. Here's another wider shot in the backyard. You can see literally in a backyard in San Francisco. Interestingly enough, they're very rusty by this time. They're missing a few parts, but quite surprisingly, the headlights were still on, which surprised me. I wish I could go back to that time and even just with an hour with a tape measure, being able to get a few important dimensions. And the first thing I keep looking at that, I'm dying to have those headlights because I've only been able to locate one so far. Jamie, next slide. Another later use was in military railroads. This is the Quartermaster Corps picture that was taken in April 1941 in Fort Dix, New Jersey. You see a Davenport locomotive there getting some water. There was a half a dozen of those. 1941. They had got Plymouth locomotives, 7-ton Plymouths that had Buddha motors in them. They found these only had 54 horsepower, and they were terribly underpowered even on the level track they had. They used these for hauling military equipment and personnel around many of the military camps, including Pearl Harbor. There was 2-foot gauge in Pearl Harbor. Next slide. We had to make replica plates. We had pictures of them. We had a couple of different good photographs, but one of our worksmen had done these, actually poured them in his garage foundry. We made brand new plates for this number, and the number at the bottom, 1695, is the actual chassis number of this particular locomotive. We had these made. We made another set of plates for the number 1700, which is our other Davenport locomotive, and I'm having another set of plates made with 1705, which is the only other existing Davenport trench engine that's in the National Infantry Museum in Fort Benning, Georgia. They have a worn-out one there that is on display. It's been recently restored, and I'm donating the plates so they'll have at least their original plates. Nobody knew what number it was, but we were able to document what number it was in the research we did on the process here. Next plate. This is our other chassis that basically we tore down to the original fabric. There were a few other pieces we used on this. There's a lot of pieces that are on it right now. This picture was taken in the last week. It shows after 3 days of cleaning I spent with trying to get this clean enough so we know what we had. It shows the original, see the original green paint on the cylinders. We were able to document that on both engines. We were able to document a lot of the original paint that was still under it that was made from the time it was manufactured. This locomotive did have the original boiler on it. I found the number matching plate on it, so we knew it was the original boiler. Got the documentation for it, but unfortunately it had been modified when it was made into a model and then was really unsuitable for use. So we had a new boiler made for that already. We'll be starting restoration on that sometime, hopefully soon. Next slide. This is a picture of one of the Baldwin locomotives in use during World War I. They were a different color. They were actually gray. And this shows it in use. They burned coal. They had trouble with these because they had assumed that their coal in France was as good as what we used back east, which is Pocahontas, or a very higher, or I should say a higher quality coal, but they had trouble with fuel. Anyway, in the back of it, you can see the cars loaded with material going to the trenches for supply. Actually, they ran 190 of these locomotives along with other French locomotives and sometimes a captured German locomotive. They would just capture somebody else's, the other side of the trench. Trench lines did move very little bit, especially later in the war, and you used their material. You could capture part of their equipment overnight, and then next morning you'd renumber it and use it on your railroad. So anyway, part of the circumstance. Anyway, next slide, Jamie. These are some World War I cars we acquired. This was also taken last week here in Rio Grande. These are cars I acquired from a sugar plantation in Mozambique, and we will restore those and make it part of the heritage fleet here. They probably won't hold water anymore, but we're going to try to, clean them up and paint them as best as we can, make them an accurate restoration at least. It won't be functional, but they'll be. We can control them behind the train. Next slide. This is the only other existing Davenport locomotive. This is number 5250, I think was the number. Here it's lettered as Quartermaster Corps, number 5. It was incorrect. Actually, I brought the boiler maker from Canada down to Georgia so we can document the mounting of this. There was no other to measure, and not having boiler drawings, we had to measure the location of all the fittings and document the boiler. And between the 3 days here, there's my jacket sitting there, between the 3 days here, we documented it. We found out the original frame number and boiler number, and the next time we repainted it, we gave all that information to the museum curator, spent 3 days with us sitting and talking about it, and next time it'll be painted up a little more historically accurate. But they did a nice job, and they got a great cover over it. Interesting enough, the National Infantry Museum, this is still owned by the National U.S. Army still owns all this, in the military museum is actually built across the military base and private base, depending on what part of the museum is privately owned and military owned. Anyway, Jamie, next slide. We have also two German Army locomotives, and the Feldbahn is what they called theirs, or field road, because they were semi-portable. This locomotive is a Hartmann, made in 1918. This one has been modified slightly. It's historic. Hartmann locomotive works. We have the ability to mostly use this one as complete. The boiler, we think, is usable. It has been accepted by the state of California already. We just have to do some, basically it's a tear down and then make sure everything is correct. This one was modified for a railroad in Golden, Colorado called the High Country Railroad. It was owned by a group of friends, and I got this from Stuart Anderson from the Stuart Anderson Black Angus. He called his company the Black Angus Steakhouses. He had a little home railroad. So anyway, we have this one was the Hartmann, and we have another one by a different manufacturer called the Henschel. Next slide. This is a Baldwin Trench engine, the original series. This particular one is ran previously, I believe, in a sugar plantation in Australia. It had been modified. A friend in France has taken it back, refitted it with original pieces mostly, and has recently, I think in the last summer, made this operational for the first time. And this is his personal, runs in his backyard, but it will be traveling. Hopefully it would be fun eventually to get them all together for something, but this is the original gray that the Baldwins were painted, and this is how they would have looked. I think he added the red paint. I don't know if that's historical. I never did a lot of research on that, but he had to make a lot of parts for this one himself, and this is a personal restoration. Jamie? This is one of our brand new boilers. We had two of them made by Boilersmith in Ontario, Canada. It's made to meet specifications from our federal government and for federal specs and the state specs. It has all sorts of modern things we had to modify. The smoke box is a little different design. The steam dome is 2 inches larger diameter, and the firebox door is 2 inches larger diameter to meet current specifications. But it's all designed to fit the original chassis, all the original plumbing locations, hardware locations. We had to modify a couple things, but luckily the original dome cover fit over this with minor modification. This one is set to run at 200 psi. The original boiler was 178, so our theoretical horsepower is a little greater. And we made a couple of different changes that will cause it to be we're hoping it will steam a little bit better. These were documented to be poor steamers, but I think the documentation was due, the bad rap they had for it was due to the bad coal they had. They had bad steaming characteristics. Jamie, next slide. These are some of our new hardware parts. We modified the locomotive to have air brakes. We had some non-historical parts. We had gathered the air pump on the left was made up in Walnut Creek, California by a gentleman, had his company Winton Locomotive Works. He made mostly 7.5-inch gauge locomotives, but he made some 15-inch gauge locomotive. There was locally a 15-inch gauge locomotive up in Atascadero, California. Historical equipment, we tried to fit it as much as we can with either exact replicas or original parts. We were able to collect Sullers injectors, which were time period, but perhaps a different brand. We don't know which brand locomotive injectors were fitted, but we have Suller 3.2, the correct size. was able to acquire 3 of those, and then our shop and the Strasbourg Railroad helped remanufacture them to make them all usable. Jamie, next slide. There's the chassis after the boiler's been painted and mounted. Like I said, the original paint job. This is before the saddle tanks were mounted. You see one unique thing that the the Vulcans and the Davenports did is they moved the dry pipe from inside the locomotive smoke box to the outside to the cylinders. Apparently, they had big trouble being able to clean the cinders out of the smoke box during servicing, so they moved this out. This is one of the changes made by the manufacturers to reduce the problems they were having with the original Baldwins in France. Also, this one has the suspension changes that were made. We know that were made to make them better tracking locomotives and better steaming locomotives. Jamie, next. Different view. This actually shows the dry pipe external on the smoke box a little bit better. It does show a couple of different details. Also, you'll see the round holes in the front of the cab door, the cab face. That was a French, they called those the spectacles of the locomotive, not front windows like we would. And they had actual like ship windows in them. I'm sure that was just their preference. We built these to basically fit their needs because we were supporting their troops along with our troops on the track. Next slide, Jamie. This is the locomotive sitting in our diesel shed. Right now our roundhouse isn't done, but this is where it resides most of the time until we get the rest of the yard made, the roundhouse and turntable facility. You'll see my Plymouth diesel out there in front of it, which is a 1920s Plymouth locomotive that actually is identical to what the U.S. Army had utilized in many of the facilities where they used the same 2-foot gauge equipment. Jamie, next slide. Here's the locomotive, mostly completed. I was able to find some other parts, and we're still finding more and more parts. I was able to actually, due to a lead coming off a friend in Los Angeles, we were able to find a Craigslist ad for this headlight up in Martinez, California. And once we located it and got pictures of it, I drove up the next day and bought it because I'd been looking for time and looking for more of these for some time. And I find all these parts are out there, but they are very, very scarce. And what we can't find, we pretty much have to make. Next slide, Jamie. This is looking the other direction inside the diesel shed. You'll see some of the completed locomotive and future projects sitting inside, out of the weather for the time being. They do get rearranged regularly. And this is just a metal shed. The roundhouse will be a little better insulated and better prepared for having a wet steam locomotive inside. Next slide. Another close-up view showing some of the fitting of some of the parts. This is before we had plates on the front. These did have very large water tanks, and they're good for about an hour or two each we've found so far. We've run the engine about half a dozen times and making tune-ups for it, and it's getting close to having an official debut here pretty soon. Next slide. New plate there, new spot plate made by the same people that did the builder's plates. The spot plate, probably a little nicer decorated than they were for the war, but we tried to make them as pretty as we can, but tried to keep the historical patina. The lubricator picture inside the cab on the right, I'd found on discoverlivesteam.com, a live steam locomotive and train advertising place, and actually found a pretty accurate lubricator. This is a dual feed lubricator. It says built for the Davenport locomotives by the Ohio Injector Works. Very rare find. We just, one of the biggest challenges was getting new glasses made for the site on it. It took about a year and a lot of contact just getting the glass to fit inside of it that wouldn't leak, because it is under the same pressure as the boiler is of a locomotive. Next slide, Jamie. A couple more detail shots. You see the spectacle covers and the spectacle glass. They are hinged top and bottom, so you can open them, get a little ventilation. They modified these over the years for different purposes. They extended the cab roofs to cover over the coal bins in the back. I think there wasn't enough coal space because the modification pictures I've seen, they'd cut holes in the back so they could put coal on the flat car behind it and then shovel it into it, and other modifications over the years I see bits and pieces of. A little close-up of the headlight. Unfortunately, I don't have the lantern for it yet. It had been modified. Somebody had modified it to put an electric light bulb inside of it. But it has the original paint and decal on it, which was just absolutely awesome to see how original it was. Next slide. More detailed shots of the inside of the cab. We did make modifications to the water glasses to make them safer and meet current code. You see the fire door has a little bit bigger ring than it was originally manufactured to be. We left the original handbrake, but we did add air brakes to the engine. It originally had steam brakes on the drivers and the handbrake for just the drivers. A close-up of the air pump. I think it's really neat. I was just looking at some of the Disney World Fort Wilderness steam engines. They had the same pumps, the only other ones I had seen of this, and I'd like to find some more because they're an ideal size for our needs for future restorations. I wish I could have about 4 more of these. Next slide. Here's some of the brand new, on the left is the brand new brake valves. These are new. They kind of mimic the outline of the original steam valves, but these are now air valves for operating the train brake on the left and the locomotive brake independent on the right, the bottom. We were using a regular Ashton, more modern, I should say, probably air brake gauges back there. See, and I was noticing in some pictures that's the same air brake gauge set you'll find in most Southern Pacific locomotives, and 4449 has the same brake gauges. 2472 has the same brake gauges. Kind of fun. I wish I could find more, but they're really scarce. Next slide. Another good picture of the back head here. Most of the back head had all been changed. When this locomotive had been modified with the traction engine boiler, it lost all of its appliances. It had lost throttle valve, Johnson bar. A bunch of parts had been lost or changed, so we had to make replica new ones of all that. And most of that we did try to make 2 of everything because we have another engine to do. Next slide. Another picture of the inside of the cab showing the appliances, all in the original locations. All new valves. The steam valves are all new. We did try to get as much historical hardware to go on them. We're able to use historical handles as much as we can. The lubricator for the cylinders is the big brass thing on the left. The lubricator for the air pump is the one hanging on the cab wall in front, to the right of the pressure gauge. The pressure gauge, we did have one we already had, perfect pressure gauge that was actually dated 1917, so it comes from the period also. Next slide. Another pair of wide-angle photographs showing the inside of the cab on the left, very wide angle. Looking down onto it, you see the tricoques, the 3 valves in a row just below the center. Those are for, you just open a little valve and call the tricoque, and that way you can physically check where the water level is. The 2 gauges are to the left of that. There's an angle gauge and a reflex water level gauge, the big brass thing, and then there's an angle gauge there. So we have what's required by law, and we have one that's also a little more historical. Having the redundancy is a very good idea when you have a steam engine, because you can never compromise your water level in a boiler. And we have some pretty steep grades. We just want to be as safe as we can. Next slide. This is a look across from what would be a fireman's position through the spectacle across to the east, showing some of the equipment across the yards as they get built. Next slide. Another picture, this one's a little earlier, as things move in and out of the, we take various pictures as things move in and out of the engine sheds, and we keep finding more parts. The engine is pretty much finished, but we're still finding little bits and pieces as we can fit things together. Next slide. Another slide at the front before the, I guess, yeah, we already installed all the air and we hadn't installed the plates then. Next slide. Here's a slide just on its first test run up the hill here. We have about a mile of track done, and the engine performed very well. Right now we're burning oak, which burns very well in it. We don't have any coal available at the time, and the oak smells very good, I must say, because the first thing everybody says to get off and let's go get some tri-tip sandwiches. It makes you, it keeps you busy burning oak, but it's very, very fun, and it does fire very well on oak. But it's a total success in restoration. We're going to be building another one just like it. Next slide. And here it is pulling its first train up the hill. Everybody that was within range came over and wanted to jump on the first train, so all the shop guys were there, and we took a ride to the top of the hill, and it performed just like a brand new engine out of the box. It was quite a pleasurable experience. Next slide. And end of my presentation. So I'll turn it back to JD.
Yeah, let me open up all the mics again and questions for Karl about this locomotive.
Fantastic job, Karl.
Thank you, Karl.
Thank you. We hope to do more. We have a total of 16 steam engines here. We got a couple lifetimes full of work.
Wow.
I am impressed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments, Karl? Okay, thank you, Karl, very, very much for this, and everybody who attended. We will see those of you who wish to next Saturday, the 14th, same time, same everything. We're going to be talking about a classroom model railroad project from about 15 plus years ago. So, see you all then, and thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karl.
You're welcome.